Today we'll be presenting on brain-machine interfacing. My colleagues are Wetteland, Haley Ostrin, and I'm Haley Wilder. Our intentions today are to go over the usefulness of brain-machine interfacing when the gold standard is not an option. However, since brain-machine interfacing has stemmed from the advancements in prosthetics, we will kind of go over a brief history of where prosthetics have been in the past and where they are now. Then we'll move on to non-invasive and invasive BMIs and where we expect BMIs to be in the future.
Okay, so brain-machine interface is a pathway between your brain and an external device. The most common use for a brain-machine interface is for communication. There's a lot of disease that affects the muscle's ability to read messages from the brain. So brain-machine interfaces are used as a pathway for patients who have these diseases in order to communicate. There's different types of brain-machine interfaces. There's ones that read blinking. There's some that have electrodes connected to the head or even electrodes connected directly to the brain. What we're going to be focusing on mainly today is how brain-machine interfaces are used for amputees in controlling their prosthetics. There's several different ways that they can control their prosthetics. The most common way is that the electrodes are connected to the chest area, and it reads the waves there and is used to help control the prosthetic. But there are also images of these electrodes directly connected to the brain, which allows for a higher functionality. As you can see, there is also a lot of research going into using brain-machine interfaces for able-bodied users, so people like you and me, to enhance their natural abilities, such as Iron Man. So the Army is actually looking into a lot of this use. They were looking into it for nonverbal communication, but the rate of reading the brainwaves is really slow. It's around 25 bits per second, so that hasn't seemed really effective. But they've also been looking into it for having airplanes that are driven by the mind, so that's really cool and would help save our soldiers. The gold standard obviously is how a normal brain communicates with your muscles. So the cerebral cortex is where your motor cortex is located, and it sends signals through your brain to the basal ganglia. And at the basal ganglia, this is where the finer motor control is whittled down. So basically the brain can only control contraction. It doesn't control relaxation of the muscles. So if you're making a prosthetic, you have to keep that in mind. So your muscles work in antagonistic groups. So when your bicep contracts, it's contracting more than your tricep and vice versa. So in the basal ganglia, it's exciting the contraction of a certain muscle more than its antagonistic group. So then these waves go through your spinal cord and reach a neuromuscular junction, which has motor units at it. And these motor units are what control the strength of your response. So if you want a really strong response, you can do it one of two ways. You can either have a high frequency of waves hitting that motor unit, so it keeps signaling the muscle very rapidly, or you can have multiple motor units signal at the same time for a stronger overall impulse. There's also something called population coding, and basically all that means is the more neurons that are firing, the finer control you have of your muscle movement.
Here we have our timeline. Since the beginning of civilization, there have been prosthetics. Initially, they started out as more of an aesthetic piece, but as time progressed, they began to have mechanical properties where either the person could control the device with the body, move the arm, so they regained some functionality, and eventually we developed into the actual mechanical system with circuitry, and we're getting to where we are now. One type of device that's still used currently is a body-controlled mechanism. It is a prosthetic that is attached to the body, and you move one part of the body to make the arm function. So the drawbacks with this type of device is that it takes a lot of strength to be able to move it, and so they can be rather uncomfortable. The remote-controlled prosthetics are programmed, so they have a lot of delay depending on how the user is able to communicate with the device. So in a case of extreme ALS, like Stephen Hawking, he has to use a clicker, and so it takes quite a while for him to be able to make any sort of movement with his device. Finally, the brain-controlled or myoelectric prosthesis is actually controlled by electrical impulses from the brain, communicating with biosensors that result in movement. So here is an actual person learning to use a myoelectric arm, and he's been using it for 13 hours and was already able to control it. Some of the clips here are some of the processes that can be done with in a myoelectric arm. So these arms have different degrees of freedom, which means they have different joints that are able to move, and the more joints that move, the harder it is to keep them all coordinated. So you can see in this last clip that there was a cracker that was actually picked up, and that is just kind of indicative of how well controlled the grip control is.
So I'll be going over the cortical-based BMEIs, and the first is non-invasive, which this field began in the 60s and 70s when the first attempts were made to provide subjects with feedback from their own brain activity. And the goals of these experiments were to give humans the ability to control their own brainwaves, which had mixed results. But in 1971, a scientist, Black, was able to condition dogs to control their own hippocampal theta rhythms, and that is the basis for the EEG-based brain-machine interfaces. So these are obviously EEG-based, and it reads brain activity and then uses the computer, and the brain activity is deciphered deciphers the intention, and then this can be used to control computer cursors and other devices such as wheelchairs. The benefit of this is avoiding potential dangerous surgeries. However, it has a very limited capacity with a transfer rate about 5 to 25 bits per second, which is not sufficient enough to control mechanical arms and such. The EEG-based UCIs are also, as discussed before, lacks spatial and temporal resolution because of the overlapping of electrical signals, so it's not viable for advanced machinery. Invasive cortical implants where you have an electrode on the brain, and this also began in the late 60s and early 70s with Eberhard Betz, who performed experiments on monkeys and took their readings from of electromyography while recording the activity of a single motor cortex cell. And then in the 1980s, Edward Schmidt proposed that you could use this technology in order to voluntarily they use the voluntary motor commands that could be taken from raw cortical neural activity and then be used to control prosthetic devices. So most of the invasive or implanted cortical BMIs use electrocorticography, which records activity of the cerebral cortex directly from brain, like there's brain contact. And so using this, the readout can be deciphered using pattern recognition algorithms, and then an artificial network can be established. And then most of these experiments going on today vary number of cortical implants, implant location, type of neural signal, and size of the neural sample. You can see here, this is a rhesus monkey who's controlling an arm with 4 degrees of freedom, but using the cortical implants to get a treat. This is the same scientist 3 years later, and now we have a mechanical arm with 7 degrees of freedom. And this is a brain-computer interface with a human, and I don't know if you can see it, but he's trying to draw a circle, which could use some improving.
Okay, so the prosthetics so far only use this part of the pathway, the brain communicating with the prosthetic, but would be ideal in the future would be the prosthetic also communicating with the brain. So at the end of a regular hand, you have receptors. So there's different types. There's receptors for pressure, there's receptors for frequency, vibration, and you can use elements we've learned about in this class, such as a strain gauge or filters, to imitate these receptors and feed them back into the brain. So why this is important is because I'm sure all of you have heard of amputees who have phantom pain, and this is because when they lose a body part such as a hand, the brain stops receiving stimulus from that body part, and so other parts of the body will invade that area of the brain and start receiving confusing stimulus from that part of the body with the missing body part. For example, if I lost my arm and someone stroked my cheek, which is right next to the arm section, I would feel that sensation in my missing limb. So we could also use a brain-machine interface to treat phantom pain and revive sensation in lost limbs.
So in the future, we expect the BMI field to develop into neurocognitive prostheses, which will actually have the brain communicate with the prosthetic limb and have the limb communicate back to the brain. Here are our references and any questions.
How do you differentiate between what to do, with different movements? How does what's the difference? Brain.
In the myoelectric arm?
Sure.
It's picking up brain patterns from that area of the brain. So as you saw in the timeline, there was an image where they had electrodes all over an amputee's arm and chest, and so they use those to be able to pick up on, just like with an EEG, you can pick up on certain parts of the brain based on which electrodes you look at. They're doing the same thing with these. It's in the 2010 right here.
Right, but then,
So I was talking about the different motor units.
Right.
So the brain stimulates different motor units depending on the movement that it wants to have occur. So certain motor units are going to respond when you.
If I can add on to that, most of the myoelectric systems, there's actually surgery performed on their chest where they move some of the nerves and muscles so that to amplify the signal, so that the electrodes can pick that up. And if they actually try to move, they can actually move the muscles and can see some weird movements there that we wouldn't usually have. So they actually kind of rewire you to do that. I don't know who's first. It's Sherman.
So going off on Ron's question, each specific movement corresponds to a certain frequency that this EEG will pick up on that will distinguish that a right arm has a range between this and that.
You kind of have to train a computer. That's why I mentioned that the man in the clip had been using his for 13 hours. The computer will learn to read what you're thinking. So it's literally the same process as you moving your arm. Your brain, whatever you're thinking, your arm, okay, I'm thinking my arm's moving up, now my arm's moving up. So the computer is now just doing this instead of a physical being.
But doesn't need it to compare it to an actual, someone who actually has an arm that's moving it?
No,
So
that's why it takes so long you have to be thinking, move your arm up, move your arm up, move your arm up for a long time before the machine will actually say, oh, this is what they want. So it takes a long time.
does it go through a checklist until
Yeah.
it gets what you want?